You're watching News at Prime, and we continue with our coverage. You're watching News at Prime, and we continue with our coverage on the build-up to the President's State of the Nation address. And we're joined by a panel of guests to unpack and dissect some of the important issues we have flagged for you. Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko is an economist at Stellenbosch Business School. She's in front of me tonight in studio. Also joining the discussion is University of Johannesburg Center for Development, or Center for African Diplomacy and Leaderships, at Dr. Oscar van Heerden. He is on the virtual platform. We also are joined by the Center for Development Enterprise Executive Director, Bernstein, and we also are joined by Walter Sisulu University's political analyst, Dr. Ongama Mtimka. To all of my guests, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Let me start in studio. Dr. Moleko, President Ramaphosa will deliver the 2026 State of the Nation address. What should he prioritize?
A very good evening, and I think that is a huge question in the current context that we're in. I think most households are constrained. Business expectations are that we need to restructure. We are looking at the plethora of State of Nation promises from the historic years in his administration, which have not yielded necessary outcomes. Growth is sluggish. Investment outcomes are not positive. We have seen some improvement in terms of business confidence, but that's really not necessarily on the back of some outcomes of what the government strategy around the economy has realized. So I think that there is a lot that we want to see being done to drive growth, to drive employment numbers higher, and to also drive productivity, to drive SMME and enterprise development further, and to deepen capital movement within those subsectors and also those spatial patterns where you're not really seeing economic activity. I think broadly as a nation, there's a lot of issues around crime and criminal intelligence. There's a lot of issues around state capacity, building the capacity of the state, not just the economic focus. And I think there's a lot of issues around the performance of the public sector across healthcare, across education, and across, I think, the functionality of the state, where you want to see an optimization both of the state and state-owned enterprises. And we are seeing a turnaround with Eskom and with some of the entities of the state, where whether it's the revenue authority in terms of tax collection being optimized and much higher in terms of revenue collection, but also seeing some real gains with the turnaround on the productivity side because of the Eskom recovery. And a surprise, and I think to all South Africans, is the SAA turnaround, which we love to lament when it's budget, of course, that these state-owned entities are not performing. So I think he's got an array of issues to deal with, but it shouldn't be about promises and a wish list. It should be reconciling what has been promised historically, where are we now, and what do we need to do going forward with what hasn't worked. And clearly on a growth front, which is what is on everyone's table, whether you're a household, whether you're a business, whether you're a civil society, it's affecting you on the bottom line. And I think that's the heart of what everyone in South Africa is interested to hear about.
An array of issues, and I think the best way to sum up what you've said, an array of issues in order to aid the job creation issue in our country, because you touched on it, unemployment. Let's throw a similar question to the panels, the guests that are joining us on the virtual platform. Dr. Mtimka, let me come to you. I'm just doing this in the order of appearance. In your mind, or to your mind, what should President Ramaphosa prioritize?
Good evening to you and your guests, as well as your viewers. It's been a long time you and I spoke, Xoli. I am still at Nelson Mandela University, so I know that Walter Sisulu did recruit Mandela, but I haven't left this wonderful place in Gqeberha. So I think that if we look at the president and the role of the state, one, there is a need to arrest the decline in local government in terms of the leadership there and the extent to which municipalities can play a developmental role as mandated by the Constitution. Now, I start with that because it's a direct function of the political mess that the dominant party system has put us in, where to secure office, to attain and secure office or be promoted in the last 30 years has been devoid of whether you are performing or not. So the big issue is, to what extent is there going to be stringent mechanisms to get local government, to get people to get the quality leaders they deserve at a local government level. And then if you look at the speeches of the president in the last, say, 6 years, what you will find is that he's tended to focus on the enabling role that government needs to play as far as infrastructure delivery is concerned, investment promotion is concerned, as well as what my friend Nthabi was saying, small business support. Now, it would be great to hear, especially when it comes to the investment promotion drive, because lots of commitments were made to projects, amounting, the target was $1 trillion, and we heard, I think last year, if not the year before last, that target had been exceeded. Now, the question is, where are these projects taking place, and are they creating jobs? Because that's what we need in South Africa, not just to attract investment, but to ensure that it's job-creating investments that have got positive upstream and downstream linkages with their host economies. And then lastly, we should also be looking at what the state does to create an enabling environment for individuals and society to thrive at large. Crime and corruption, fighting crime and corruption is a crucial part of that. Because if people are not feeling safe, they're not going to be investing, they're not going to be taking risks as much as they should when it comes to, for example, basic things like operating hours for a business, and the costs of doing business in the country. I note what Nthabi is saying around the improvements as far as energy availability, but the cost of that energy has become huge, both for private residents and for businesses. South Africa used to be a cheap electricity market or destination for investment. Unfortunately, we can no longer sell that to the world. And I don't think we should be comfortable just being able to bring back security of the energy grid. We should also be striving to go back to a favorable cost environment for electricity usage in South Africa.
And Bernstein, let's come to you. I'd like you to weigh in on exactly what your thoughts are as for President Ramaphosa to prioritize.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with almost everything that everybody said, but what I'm looking for is much more ambition for reform and much more urgency. So on the one hand, the country enters 2026 in a better fiscal and economic situation than we have since 2019. But you have to remember how very bad things are. So yes, we are making progress on energy and logistics, but it's very, very slow. And it's not yet fully completed or secured. We don't have a fully functioning energy market, and as the previous speaker said, prices are incredibly high, and now we have pushback from vested interests, including Eskom. The president has to persevere and just speed things up and deal with vested interests to get the kind of competitive electricity market the country needs. Logistics is very much more recent reforms, but enormous challenges ahead. Transnet is financially very fragile. The infrastructure, there's an enormous budget required for infrastructure, and we're in early days of the reform. I want to just say how modest our ambitions are. According to Operation Vulindlela, our ambition, our aim by 2030 is to have the amount of freight tonnage carried by rail that South Africa achieved in 2016. That's according to Operation Vulindlela. So the real credibility that the president has to try and engineer is not promises, but a gear change. How are we doing in competitiveness to our peer countries? And we're struggling. Since he became president, all the promises, we have averaged 0.6% growth per annum.
Yeah.
The worst of all the Democratic presidents. And I'm afraid to say unemployment today is about over 200,000 worse than it was a year ago. And we're already probably the world's worst place for unemployment. So big challenges ahead. The government, in my view, the president has to change gear on everything and a much greater urgency.
All right. Oscar van Heerden, before we get into specifics, please also weigh in on what you think the president should prioritize.
Well, I mean, I think I agree largely with quite a lot of what's being said. The urgency point is certainly a very important one. You know, all the efforts that we've seen over the last 6 years needs to happen faster. But having said that, I do think the president is going to take this opportunity to make a link between the 2018 Tumamina New Dawn speech and the fact that we've turned a corner. I agree with Anne. It's a slow process. It's a very steady and slow turning the corner. But I do think the president is going to emphasize the positives and start with the positives in terms of the slight growth in the economy, the S&P rating, you know, the fact that we are off the grey list, the SARS things that Nthabi is talking about, transport and logistics, still early days, but the private sector is very much excited that we've gotten those rail from pit to port. It's beginning to happen. Of course, there's also the successes, as everyone has mentioned, from the ESCOM. But I want to agree with Ongama that the cost is significant. The household cost has tripled, quite honestly, and it's just not sustainable. So that's going to be a serious thing. And he's going to talk about, again, the R1 trillion that's been made available for infrastructure in general, roads, electricity, and so forth. But of course, very importantly, on water and water infrastructure. Small budget surplus. So those are the positives that I think the president is going to take credit for. He's going to talk of the need for a new social compact between business, labor, civil society, and government. And he's going to link that, obviously, with the national dialogue. He's going to tell us what is the way forward, where are we at the moment. And then finally, he's going to touch on a few international aspects, of course, which we can get into a bit more detail later.
All right.
The local government issue, he's going to spend some time on it. It's going to unfortunately be a lot of promises and what we can do between now and the election. But I think we've already lost the voters on that one.
All right. Okay. Now that I've gotten everybody's thoughts on this, we're going to take a short break and then we'll drill deeper into the specifics. My guests have touched on this and they probably won't remember, but I think it looms large. We're going to take a special focus on this topic and a few others. So stay with us. Watching News at Prime, if you're just joining us, a reminder that we are discussing the 2026 State of the Nation Address expectations. And my guests, I think you've met them by now. They've introduced themselves. Let's then go straight into the nitty-gritties. Nthabiseng, Moleko. Unemployment. 8 million South Africans are sitting at home without work as of the third quarter of 2025. Many of them are young, educated, but they just can't find work. What needs to be done?
Firstly, let me correct you. It's 12.5 million. The expanded definition takes into account the more than 3.5 million South Africans that have simply lost hope. That effectively means when you report on the narrow definition, which is the 8 million, you are leaving out those youth that have what we call chronic unemployment or have literally lost hope in the last 7 days and have said, you know what, I've been looking for a job for a year, for 2 years, even for 5 years with a certificate or a graduation certificate. I cannot simply continue to go on this trajectory. and I've given up. So we're sitting with a ticking time bomb. You ask the question of what ought to be done and what should we expect from Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, His Excellency. The first thing is, if you don't do a proper diagnostic assessment of the reasons for the high levels of unemployment, you will put the wrong solution to the problem. The first issue is, in the last 30 years, we have seen a largely services-driven growth in South Africa. We have seen an expansion of sectors with low employment intensity. What do I mean by that? For every growth or percentage of growth, there are certain sectors that have driven growth in South Africa. You have seen retail, people consume. You have seen properties, people's asset appreciation. That doesn't lead necessarily to job creation unless we reform the underlying value chains and the productivity underpinning those growth sectors. And so if you have high services sectors like property, ICT, and high skilled sectors, where South Africa conundrum is you have a low skills, low economic activity base where people don't have the necessary experience primarily to enter into these services sectors. You have seen a deindustrialization. South Africa's moved from mid-20s in the last 30 years to almost 14% of GDP coming from manufacturing, which is industrialization. So the sector where you see vehicle production, we're talking about manufacturing, where you see construction and utilities, that forms a component of the secondary sector. We've seen a deconcentration, or rather deindustrialization of that, i.e. a contraction. And so these high employment absorption sectors, or what we call as economists, high labor absorption, these sectors have all actually contracted, and substantially so. The other aspect is that the sectors and the provinces that have grown remain Gauteng, Western Cape, and to a small degree have seen KwaZulu-Natal coming into the fray. The problem is the provinces that have not seen economic activity and expanding. Yeah. So that's Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Eastern Cape, all the others. I won't mention all of them due to time, but we know the problem there is that those provinces have more than 40% economic unemployment. Expanded definition, you start to see actually more people in the Eastern Cape are not working than those that are working. This is a crisis. Wow. So you're sitting with 6 provinces with no economic activity. They're economic deserts, if I can put it bluntly. Wow. You're seeing unemployment because of these industries and sectors not expanding. So your symptom or your pill to that in a presidential speech has to be productivity gains in those provinces, has to be infrastructure investment in those provinces, has to be making sure that capacitation of skills and productivity in manufacturing, specifically capabilities, are built in those sectors. And lastly, Goli, before you shut me up, SMME development or enterprise development with the youth, with women, and with those areas requires public procurement to come on board, requires that the private sector and the public collaborate to allow new entrants. And those are black people that have never been in the economy. Worse now, with 3.1 million discouraged work seekers who simply don't have experience. You have to devise public employment programs at a massive scale urgently, so that these people get into the economy and become economically active.
Ongama Mtimka, let's come to you. Public employment programs is what Nthabiseng Moleko is suggesting. But I suggest to you that you have the expanded public works initiative. You have the Yes initiative. There's so many of these that I can count where government has sought to try and bring in young people, new entrants, in trying to give them some skill so that they at least feel that they are doing something with their lives. What do you think the president ought to say here? Is Nthabiseng Moleko on the right path?
So I think it's important when leaders are leading to apply themselves to contexts and respond to those contexts. And I think that the mass employment schemes, as well as the reskilling initiatives that were introduced through the joint initiative for priority skills acquisition, the CETAs, among others, those are good when it comes to responding to the context of where you are, of a population whose skills are not matching what the economy requires, a fact that has been apparent in South Africa since the late 1960s throughout until today. But where I'd like to point is I want to build on what Nthabi was saying. So in 1996, government looks at South Africa growth patterns, which provinces have got, growth and which ones are marginalized, and starts what they call the spatial development initiatives. And that started the Special Economic Zones program. Back then, it was called the Industrial Development Zones program. Big problem with South Africa is that we tend to have short-sighted politicians who, as they succeed one another as leaders, are not taking what's good and what works and pursue them and make sure that we realize the objectives of those programs. So in the Eastern Cape, for example, we've retained some manufacturing, but not to the scale that was required or envisaged at the time that both the Kucha Industrial Development Zone and the East London Development Zone were envisaged.
Yeah.
I've said that to say we are lacking in South Africa a commitment to a coherent national strategy that we all buy into. Our leaders, both in business and in government, and we keep leaving business out, both in business and in government, do not have a sense of national priorities that they are pursuing. It's almost as though we are creating an environment for extraction where everybody, whether they are engaging at NEDLEC or elsewhere, are concerned about how best to extract from South Africa the best that they can, get the necessary enabling environment for themselves and their firms, and thrive while the rest of society is not thriving. We've gotten to a stage now where, for example, if you look at what's happening in the auto sector, one market closes and we have no way to respond as a country.
Yeah.
We've gotten to a stage now where neither the economy nor the political can survive unless we commit to a coherent, collaborative national strategy that prioritizes South Africa. We have the latent potential, even in the provinces that Nthabi was talking about, that are, marginalized. And we know that they were designed to be labor-sending provinces. They were never designed to become hosts of development themselves, except for gambits like the decentralization projects of the National Party, which were more driven by influx control imperatives than the growth of these regions. So the point I'm making is we need to commit to a national strategy that we can all buy into and ensure that we work. Government has put in infrastructure, for example, in some places with no corresponding private sector investment.
And Bernstein, let me come to you. So 6 provinces of South Africa tonight are being described as economic deserts. The other commentator says they were designed to be labor-sending regions. What sectors should we be listening out for that will re-energize those provinces, that will bring them to life, as opposed to the economic deserts that have been spoken about here tonight?
Well, let me answer the question in a different way. I agree that we need to discuss 12.5 million people who would like to work, who cannot find a job, not the lower figure. And although we might need probably need some more public works programs, that is not the answer. It cannot deal with the scale of unemployment in the country. We have proposed a number of measures that I would hope the president would announce, but I don't think he will. We have to change the law in order to make our economy much more labor absorbing. So this is a critical component. We need to change the laws so that big companies and big unions can negotiate whatever they want when they're in the room, but they can't extend those conditions to small firms, to rural firms, to new firms who are not at the negotiating table. So that would be a dramatic legal reform to help make South Africa a more labor-absorbing economy. The second thing I would like the President to announce, which would, I think, make a very big difference, is we need a whole new approach to how we think about small enterprise and promoting small enterprise throughout South Africa.
Yeah.
We've got the idea that somehow we should spend lots and lots of state money through officials deciding which companies to support and how to support small enterprise. And we're saying this is the wrong approach entirely, and it's not working because the sector is not growing. What we need to do is call on the experts in our society in identifying firms that have potential and mentoring them and providing effective financing, and that's the private sector.
Yeah.
So we should take a whole lot of money out of officials' hands, put it to the private sector in a competitive way, and then make them report once a year very transparently on how they are actually building a much more dynamic small business sector, which instead of sort of keeping on hoping that the wrong people who don't have experience in business will be able to identify which firms could prosper. So that's a second thing I would hope. The third, which is geographic and not just national, although all of this plays out in the provinces across the country, is we have made a proposal for an experiment to take Kruger, which has an underutilized port, and to turn it into a policy experiment on can South Africa attract mainly foreign investment for low skill manufacturing jobs, which has been one of the key ingredients that has helped many other developing countries get out of poverty and unemployment, but we refuse to try this. We're saying, let's try it now and see if it works. We've invested public money already. We don't need a lot more. Let's see if we can get something to happen that's new, and that is a low-skill manufacturing sector for export.
Okay. And Bernstein actually has led me quite nicely to you, Oscar van Heerden, as an international relations expert. She talks about attracting foreign investment into the country. Who are South Africa's friends right now internationally, and how can they help? How much, perhaps, can they help in trying to bring investment into South Africa?
Yeah, Colin, before I come to that very important question of international relations, maybe I must just try and turn things on its head a little bit.
Sure.
I think everyone must agree that the narrative that government must create employment is false. This is a mandate of the private sector. VLSA, BUSA, our various chambers, the private sector must create jobs, not government.
Yeah.
We can go on and on about government must do this, government must do that, but the truth of the matter is government can only create an enabling environment. And this malarkey of, if we change the law, if we privatize, and if we change the labor laws, then for some, miraculously, the private sector will come to the party, is clear blackmail that is taking place. The private sector is simply refusing to do what they need to do to create jobs. And government is not going to deal with the 12 million unemployment. It is the private sector that must do so. And I think it's important that we clear this narrative, because every time we talk of unemployment, everyone is saying government must solve this problem.
Oscar
it is not going.
Oscar van Heerden, you should see everyone's faces here when you were talking. And Nthabiseng Moleko, for starters, thought that actually he is directing this to me, and Bernstein is also shaking her head. Ongama Mtimka is laughing. Are you suggesting here that the old saying that the private sector in South Africa is on an investment strike, is that still the narrative today? Is that what you're saying? This was in the days of Jacob Zuma, by the way.
It's not only on an investment strike. It is basically saying that unless there's an environment in which we can have cheap labor and make more profit, we are not going to invest. And we are not going to create jobs. And Nthabiseng, I mean, with all due respect, they can shake their heads, But the truth of the matter is, in every democracy and in every country that we talk about, it is the private sector that creates jobs, that creates employment. It is not government.
All right,
and
Oscar,
so we must move away from this narrative. Now,
allow me to do this. Allow me to do this before you go to international relations, because I can see this is heating up. Okay, Nthabiseng, quickly respond to Oscar, and then immediately after you, Anne is going to come in. Very quickly,
Let me
please.
just come with some stats. 2004, 2005, 2006, South Africa had what I call golden years from an economic perspective. We stabilized our monetary policy, we stabilized our growth. In fact, we had the highest levels of growth post-democracy. What the government did very well was on the back of both the national strategies, you had an integration across all the SOEs together with the state, together with the private sector, which led to unemployment, and I'll use the narrow definition, reaching 22%. This was post-democracy, what I'd call the golden years. So everyone refers to those years prior to Jacob Zuma at the time of former President Thabo Mbeki. Now, why I say that the structural inequalities, it has been proven beyond doubt that the private sector doesn't have the capabilities. He himself, Oscar, is saying they don't have the intent because they've cash hoarded. There's a paper I wrote called New Wine into New Wineskin, where I focus particularly on the financialization of the economy and how capital markets, banking sector, trillions of assets are not reinvested into the real economy.
Yeah.
But on the back of that, they're not entering into the productive side to SMMEs and to productive enterprises that can help us absorb that labor. So what you need is the state to aid that participation, but also you need the state to deal with the structural inequality of low skills and these spatial patterns that are historic. It's never been in Asia, in the US, in all the first worlds where the private sector alone does things because they look at profit, and that's a reality. So you've got to have a balancing act. And I'm not at all saying it's only the state. I'm saying a balancing act where the private sector reinvests capital, but also you have the public sector coming in where there is no profit to be made for the private sector, but you've got to deal with those economic deserts because someone has to make sure investment in infrastructure and deploying capital so that those people do not have to migrate to economic urban centers and have to be living in squalor, which we know, and there's no economic activity.
And Bernstein, if you can say this in less than a minute, I'll be very happy. Please respond to Oscar.
Well, very simply, the private sector will invest money when the conditions in South Africa are enabling and appropriate for their risk management. And there are many other countries in which the private sector can invest. So South Africa has to be competitive. I am talking about tonight an example of trying to build a low-skill manufacturing sector, because the vast majority of young unemployed people have never worked before and have come out of a terrible schooling system. So what do we do for those people? I'm saying the government has to change some of the laws, not all, very specific laws that we're itemizing to make it a more appropriate environment for investment. And then the private sector can act. But if you have an environment that's not competitive, they won't invest.
Oscar van Heerden, please finish your thought around international investors that can invest in this country.
I hope you're coming to me after that, Scully.
Oh my God. That time is such an enemy. Please go ahead, Oscar, very quickly if you can.
Yeah, no, Colly, I think the government is doing the right thing. I mean, of course, there's some problems of frustration with the United States. But I think sanity has prevailed in certain circles, even in the US, in terms of AGOA. We'll see whether Trump is going to block it. Yeah. But Senate and the House has said it has to go through with South Africa. I do think that Minister Parks-Tau and Steenhuisen and the likes are closer to a deal, a bilateral trade deal with the US. And they've been acting very maturely in that regard. We've clinched a very good trade deal with the European Union, with the United Kingdom. We've got a good trade deal with China. So the diversification of our investment and of our trade is looking up, and it is the right moves that government is making. Of course, I understand many people are worried about the #1 economy in the world, but I think those people will also agree that if those trade agreements comes with conditions and with bullying tactics and with cajoling and blackmailing, then we have to do circumspection around those trade agreements and see whether we don't look further afield with our trade agreements and investment opportunities.
All right. Ongama Mtimka, you get to have the last word. You fought for this. So in a minute, talk to us about what your thoughts are. I would have wanted to finish with the topic of local government, because someone said service delivery is not an ideology, but it's people's lived realities. I don't know whether you want to weigh in on that or you still want to talk unemployment.
Let me see if I can do it quickly. First of all, South African capital has always had a penchant for myth-making. And the very structure of the making of our approach to manufacturing and distributing or producing has always been premised on myths which have been sustained for centuries. They can pay a premium for labor in Australia, but refuse to pay that same amount in South Africa. So that's, I don't want us to leave private businesses out of the extraction attitude that's there. The second thing, Paul, is that part of what constrains business is more the structure of the South African economy, where if people innovate around products, and there are wonderful products that are coming up across the innovation ecosystem in South Africa, they don't go from designer to market, because markets are concentrated, huge distribution costs, huge companies that are few and oligopolistic. Whether you're looking at agricultural products or any type of product you can imagine, it's not easy to take products to market. Lastly, on the local government issue, I think that political parties must do us a favor in South Africa. It's them who flood the system with incompetent political leaders. And if you have incompetent political leaders, they are always going to continue to have an overbearing, a role on the extent to which municipalities can do their job and perform.
A very nice point to end this discussion on. But you have all been such a fantastic panel. Thank you very much for all that you have given us tonight. And I'm sure as a viewer, you've seen how heated it has become here. We've only dealt with one topic, by the way, and it was unemployment and the failure, or at least attempts to try and get this economy going so that people get into jobs. All of those other topics, I'm sure we're going to explore in the week leading up to SONA. Thank you very much for watching. Coming up next, you are going to have your latest headlines here on Newzroom Afrika, so please do not move an inch.